Hi, this is Kevin with WORDVICE. One decision that gives pause to thousands of beginning research writers every time they start a paper is whether to use the active or passive voice. You may have been taught in school to always use the active voice, as it connects the subject and object more directly, giving more agency to the subject and making the sentence livelier. Whereas the passive voice should be avoided whenever possible, especially in persuasive essays and speeches. While this rule generally applies to research writing as well, there is definitely a difference in application, which is why you see so many journal articles using the passive voice. At any rate, using only one voice, passive or active, can actually make a paper more difficult to read and confuse the reader about which parts of the sentence are most important. So let's talk about some general differences between the active and passive voice. In general, the active voice emphasizes the agent of the action, that is, the person, animal, or object performing the action. For example, we arranged the sample groups. Here the subject pronoun we leads the sentence, setting off its importance in the action, and leading right into the action taken against the object, sample groups. The passive voice, on the other hand, emphasizes the person or object receiving the action. For example, sample groups were arranged by us or by the researchers. In this passive construction, sample groups stands out as the most important element. And indeed it might be, as we are actually able to omit entirely by us or by the researchers. Since active voice constructions are often stronger, clearer, more direct, and more concise than their passive voice counterparts, most style manuals will advise scientific and clinical writers to write using the active voice whenever possible. However, this is not a command to silence the passive voice entirely. In fact, scientific manuscripts have tended to become more and more passive in voice in the last 15 or 20 years. And this is actually a bit of a hot topic in the journal publishing industry now, as many editors believe that the active voice should be used more and the passive voice phased out a little bit. But let's talk about 3 circumstances in which using the passive voice can be a good decision. First, choose the passive voice when the agent of the action is unimportant, unknown, or obvious to readers. For example, over 20,000 patients are diagnosed with diabetes each year in the United States. Encyclopedias have been written by scribes and scholars throughout history. In the first example, naming the agent of diagnosis is redundant, as doctors are almost universally the ones who diagnose diseases. In the second example, the author assumes the reader will not be interested in the authors. This decision, of course, depends on the focus of the study. Or perhaps the authors are unknown. The agent may, of course, be included if this information is important to the statement. Second, use the passive voice when the object of the action or the action itself is more important than the agent performing the action. In research writing, the study is clearly of greater importance than the person performing that study, unless the researcher happens to be a rock star, and thus the passive voice is often used. This action-object focus is most clearly seen in the methods section, in which the writer explains what he or she did, or rather, what was done using the passive voice. For example, frozen embryos were stored in a cryogenic tank for 2 weeks. The extract from sample A was added to sample B to create a mixture. These sentences could be written in the active voice like so. We stored the embryos in a cryogenic tank for 2 weeks. We added the extract from sample A to sample B to create a mixture. In neither of these examples does the active voice improve the sentences by shortening them or by clarifying the focus of the action. On the contrary, in both constructions, the sentences are of equal length, and the sentences in the active voice actually redirect the focus to the agent, we or our team. The active voice constructions are admittedly a bit stronger and livelier, but they seem more fitting for a short story than for an explanation of actions carried out in the course of a scientific study. Another benefit of using the passive voice in the methods section, as well as in other sections, is that it varies the cadence and structure of your sentences while retaining that emphasis on the actual work being done. One can see how a paper becomes more readable when there isn't constant emphasis on only one part of the sentence. The third circumstance in which using the passive voice is advisable is when the recipient of the action is the topic of your sentence. It is sometimes necessary to use the passive voice in order to put the most important information at the beginning of your sentence. By putting the information first, you're showing the reader that this is the central information of the sentence. See if you can identify the topic of these sentences, first in the active voice. Scientists once classified slime molds as fungi, but they no longer classify them as part of that particular kingdom. In the passive voice, slime molds were once classified as fungi, but are no longer considered part of that particular kingdom. In the first example, scientists occupies the topic position. What might this ordering indicate to the reader? Well, it shows that scientists are perhaps the main focus, or at least an important element of this information. How might this information be interpreted differently in the passive voice construction? The main difference here is that slime molds are placed in the topic position, indicating that they are the primary focus of this information. Which voice you use and how you order your elements can make a big difference in establishing the importance of one element over another, especially when both of these are the focus of your study and occur in the same sentence. Now let's discuss how we can combine the active and passive voices in a sequence of sentences to show the reader where you're going and establish a cohesive structure that makes your paper more readable. One way to do this is to create a structure that connects backwards. That is, the final statement of your paragraph or short sequence of sentences explains the purpose of the first sentence. Let's see how this works in the introduction section. The following 3 sentences are taken from the introduction section and occur in sequential order. Note how the author connects these ideas by first establishing the purpose of the study and later in the sequence bringing the reader back to this purpose. The present commentary concerns the face object UI effect. This effect can be explained by appeal to either innate or learning factors. However, this effect can also be influenced by another factor, the baseline level, which is the focus of the present commentary. The first sentence clearly and directly explains the problem of the study, that is the face object UI effect, using the active voice, setting up the reader for a further explanation that will follow. Meanwhile, the second sentence, written in the passive voice, explores some potential directions from which this problem can be approached. Finally, the third sentence unites these two ideas, or synthesizes them, using a passive voice construction. You'll also note that this third sentence is parallel with the second, that is, it has a similar syntactical structure. It unites the problem and the proposed explanations using the idea of influence as a unifying action, and this can be achieved using the passive voice. By maintaining focus on the topic, the author can create a cohesive structure that uses both the active and passive voices. Such a passage flows naturally and is more comprehensible and enjoyable to the reader than separated sentences that use the exact same constructions. In summary, there are several good reasons to use the passive voice. As a rule of thumb, use the active voice whenever possible. Use the passive voice whenever you have a good reason to do so. Consider passive voice when the agent is unknown, unimportant, or obvious to the reader. The agent is less important than the action of the sentence. The agent is less important than the topic of the sentence. Or when one element among multiple elements has greater importance in a sentence. Finally, always follow the golden rule. Read articles from the journal to which you're submitting. This is really the only way to find out what the journal expects in terms of a balance between passive and active voice. For more useful information on research writing and publication, visit WORDVICE.com. And don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. Best of luck and happy writing!